You ready for a swim, BD?
A Jedi. This is what I'm trained for. Yeah!
Hey! Who are you?
Well, it's Michael, and I'm here to talk Jedi. After a full week of tucking into some Jedi Fallen Order action from Respawn across every console imaginable, there's no argument, this game is absolutely superb, pushing beyond the Star Wars 1313 title that it really captures that imagination at the beginning of this generation, and Respawn have delivered the goods in a game that brings you right back to that imagination and wonder and awe that the Jedi and Star Wars brought way back when it all started. Perfect parries, attacks and movement, and that badass feeling you get when you play through and defeat some of these epic boss moments in the title, and it mixes it up with a beautiful balance of strong single player storyline, real-time beautiful looking cinematics, a great narrative that is believable, embellished with great moments of grandeur, cheesy moments all typical of the Star Wars history and franchise that it delivered, mixed up with that God of War style combat, huge moments of scale and awe as you traverse some of these huge monsters, and those bombastic battle sections that mix up the beauty of Dark Souls and Sekiro. It is an unwavering success on that in every level. But there are some issues with the title across the board, and I'm sure many more patches to come. The word optimization gets bandied around a lot, and in fact it's almost become a nomenclature at this point, from forum users, tech channels, tech sites, and even developers or PR teams themselves at times. The thing is, it does not mean what you think it means. Well, maybe. See, what I'm discussing here today is not a slight on Respawn, the skill of the relevant team members, your little box tucked under your TV, or even that £2,500 PC sat at your desk. This is a conversation I've had before, and could use a plethora of games or software as a whole to discuss. And I have before with my Anthem coverage, for example, back at launch. Now, maybe EA have a part to play here. But I digress, let's not get carried away with that. At the moment, Jedi Fallen Order is an excellent game with a solid story and empowering combat, as we've already covered. High quality exploration and level design with that perfect mixture and feeling of God of War at times, amongst others. What I'm covering here is the issue that it does not affect the entire game, but it can crop up often enough to cause concern and certainly requires resolution, specifically on the lower end consoles. Now I must stress, not being a member of the development team, what I am saying here is only based on educated guesses and analysis and not confirmed as all true. Unless of course the team come out and confirm it in patch notes, etc. What I cover here is the worst that can happen on all four of my consoles to a lesser or greater degree. And you may know the feeling, wow, that stutter, pausing, lockups even, that can slow down the pace and flow of the game that it delivers from one intricate planet to the next. Now let's discuss the general flow of play. The intro segment is your typical heavily scripted single player bread and butter, and it performs close to the target of 30 FPS across all machines. If you go into the performance mode on the premium consoles and unlock it, then it still isn't 60 FPS and it stutters occasionally, even on the quieter moments. Now, there's no real concerns here at that 30 FPS segment, and these segments, as they're so scripted and controlled, but they're still fun. But once we move past this and onto the game correctly, the planets of Bantoon, things change significantly from a rendering AI animation LOD perspective. The single biggest is the freedom of choice you now have, which means the dynamic flow of exploration and combat have a significant effect on the load on both the machines and the game engine itself. Now this results in some big and sudden changes in performance. Taking the base consoles, the impact even here on these smaller sections can be short-lived but significant. Coming up is the most impactful moments of the title, and that is streaming, or is widely referred to just I/O, and that doesn't really mean that much. This isn't to do with your hard drive. This isn't specifically a hard drive issue at all. Changing your hard drive, upgrading it will make no difference to these moments. The PS4 and the Xbox One S here that I'm running both have SSDs on them. The PS4 is an internal SSD, and the Xbox One S is an external SSD, and it's even quicker running here on the external SSD that is on the internal on the Xbox One S. If that was the issue, The rotational and seek time of a standard 54,000 or 72,000 RPM hard drive that you get in these consoles as standard, including the premium ones, would have a huge impact. You're talking average of 4 or 5 milliseconds just to seek to the data you want to read and then read the data yourself. All game engines have sector points where they try and stream the information off the drive before they need it, because if you have to wait to stream it when you need it, it's going to be too late. You're going to get much longer hangs than you're seeing here. And in addition to that, they write the same data multiple times to mitigate the fact that it takes that time to seek to the data on the disk. It's written multiple times so it can get there quicker. So the issue here is getting the data when it's needed, not getting the data. And the problem there comes from a couple of areas. One of them being bandwidth. That's the most obvious. All of these consoles are designed around an UMA memory subsystem, which means that the CPU and GPU share the same block of RAM, and that gives you contention issues when they're trying to read and write or access that pool of data, which means if one's doing it, it affects the bandwidth and limitations of the other. This isn't an issue that crops up on PC, simply because on PC you have two separate memory allocations, your system RAM and your GPU RAM, but you do have a bandwidth issue there for your PCI Express, so it's a different issue. And it's an issue the developers are aware of. That's why the game's designed the way it is, funneling you into these tighter sections and bringing the camera close in, or forcing you to do these slow climbs, which allow this to naturally stream in whilst you're moving, because you're limiting the amount of data that's coming out and the amount of data that's coming in. Therefore, you don't see hardly any hiccups and issues as you see on screen here. And as they are hammering the system into as much data as possible into that limited pool of RAM that has to handle your animation code, your game code, your graphics, which obviously is the biggest chunk of that, all has a constant footprint size of around 5 gig. 5.5 gig on the Ps4 Pro, or 6, and 9 gig on the Xbox One X, the biggest of the lot. That means that you have to constantly keep juggling your memory allocation, and this is a problem at all times. And as we move into much grander systems and grander games as we see now, memory becomes a bigger limitation. Most developers, if you ask them for one thing, would say memory is the biggest, quickest win to do many other things, and it can help everything. You can improve performance. Triple buffering is an example of that. This game isn't triple buffered, it's double buffered, but we'll talk about that in the performance section more. But overall, what that means is there's a limited amount of RAM available in the systems, and that means they're constantly juggling that space at all times, and therefore they have multiple sector points in the title, which causes these sudden jitters. Now, this isn't the only issue, but it is the biggest issue, because when you get to certain sections, streaming in data causes lots of impact, as you've just seen on the base consoles. Once you're in an area and combating, it's pretty stable at 30 FPS on all consoles. Not always, but we'll cover that in a moment. So to summarise, the two issues are space, the amount of RAM you've got, and bandwidth, the amount of time you can move things in and out of it. And on top of that, the Xbox One has a bigger deficit. It has lower and slower DDR3 rather than DDR4. That's around 38% the bandwidth of the PS4. Now, SRAM is in there, and I'm sure they're using it, but you have to specifically develop around that. And there's an optimization word right there. That's one piece of work the developers have to do specifically, optimize the game to use that SRAM to mitigate the fact that it's really lacking in RAM. And there's clear signs in the game that that's still an issue, or they haven't done it yet. I've just covered that earlier where it streams into textures, and again you can see here a moment in one of the cutscenes where the game can take seconds longer to load in the actual texture and the normal maps than it does on the PS4. The PS4 is still slow, it's still struggling with its bandwidth, but you can see it's much slower on the Xbox One. And in addition to this, they're also cutting back other areas of the title for obvious reasons, because the Xbox One lacks, like I say, memory and also in GPU power. One of those is shadows. You can see here on the right hand side the shadow quality is much lower resolution on the Xbox One than it is on the PS4. This carries over to the premium consoles as well, which I mentioned in my full premium analysis last week. But in addition to this, they're also cutting back on the resolution, obviously. Now, as I covered the original, the premium consoles have a higher resolution, but they have two modes. This one only has one, but all modes, after checking it in detail, because that was what I was doing in a few hours, they do have dynamic resolution. And that means we see quite a scale. And then on the Xbox One, that's quite a scale, but it's not an unknown. I've covered this many times before, right back to things like Resident Evil 7, which used a 960 by 540 output resolution on the Xbox One XS. This does the same, it goes right down to 960 by 540 on the pixel count. That sounds worse than it is. This example here, standing on Kashak, is a good example of where it really drops. This section here is very heavy on the GPU and therefore it runs at 960 by 540. 1280 by 720 is its highest point, but that temporal reconstruction, that accumulation buffer that's again all about memory, that uses that technique on Unreal Engine, improves that back up to a 1600 by 900 if you stand still. It doesn't look like a 960 by 540 title, but as you can see in the examples, it's much softer than the PS4. And this scales from a low of 1344 by 756 right up to 1600 by 900, anything in between there, although generally it's 1440 by 810, and then that reconstruction element pushes it up to 1920 by 1080, but it hits that natively. It's just that Unreal Engine reconstruction.
And make new ones. What a racket, huh? All of us risking our necks for the bosses. And the pay was better back during the Republic, too.
Hey, you really should watch what you say.
Train has stopped.
Yeah, something's going on.
Everybody up. Identification ready. Move out and line up.
Probably just another contraband inspection.
Not all issues in the game, performance issues, come from the streaming. It is GPU bound and throughput is an issue. Even if it's in RAM, it still can't push some of the alpha effects, the particles, and the general high quality visuals that are on offer throughout the title. The Xbox One S, even with the sacrifices, like I say, of cutting back the resolution of 49% at its lowest points on both machines, and the sacrifices to shadow quality and some other dips in certain areas of the title, it still suffers in action slightly more than it does on the PS4. But they both dip quite heavily. Some of the scripted sections here, it shows the deficit between the two, but once you get into action, just running along this Kashak section, like I say, this really stresses all machines out. And it's largely the worst point from the E3 demo that we saw. Running consistently at that 24-25 FPS level on both machines, with dips into 80-90 milliseconds at times, it does not feel ideal in combat. And this comes down to the fact that there's still areas where I think they can improve. Again, the shadow quality highlights, you'll see it when I open the door between two machines, but there are areas where I think they can improve and cut back some of those sections to improve performance even more. And this is the optimization stage, going into the engine, making changes, sacrifices in certain areas, tweaks here and there to make it perform better, and understanding that your API is running on hardware and writing changes in your code to supplement the hardware and the API you're talking to. But in addition to this, there's also an intrinsic Unreal Engine issue here, which I've covered before and I'll touch on again at the end of the video. But some of the sacrifices we're seeing here on resolution on all formats point to one issue, and this is one that I've mentioned before way back with my AC Unity title, regarding reducing resolution or GPU load when you're actually CPU bound. I'm not saying the title is CPU bound, but let me explain. If your title is CPU bound, then the logic is you don't need to lower resolution to improve performance. But actually, the rule of thumb is you're only as quick as your slowest part. If you've got a CPU that's taking 25 milliseconds to render a 33 millisecond frame, you're only giving your GPU 8 milliseconds to do the work. If it can't do that, it takes 11 milliseconds, then you're going to miss your frame buffer on a double buffered Vsync title like this. That means you're going to rush into the next refresh cycle, 50 milliseconds. And that's going to happen a bit back and forth because some things run asynchronously on hardware, obviously. If you cut back the resolution on your GPU a quick win, then that means that the time it takes you to do 11 milliseconds of work you can now do in 8, then you more often than not hit your 33 millisecond frame time. Now GPU isn't your issue, you're actually reducing the stress on the GPU, but it does improve performance. And that's largely what you're seeing here, and that's why many titles in alpha state always run at much lower resolutions, because teams design on much more powerful hardware and then they reduce it and scale it back down to the hardware they're targeting, i.e. the base consoles here. And this optimization stage has only recently started, I believe, and that's what we're seeing here. And resolution is linear, so scaling that is usually the quickest win to get your game performing. So a lot of the issues are memory issues, sacrificing certain buffers, and you can see it in the title, there's certain buffers, textures, certain shadow effects, certain alpha effects, certain particle effects that don't seem to be heavily scaled back, which you would normally expect of a title running on this level of hardware. And those stages haven't really kicked in yet, so I suspect a few patches later, by the time we get to Christmas, we will see much better performance, but you will see a visual degradation to what you're seeing on screen at the moment. Not massively, very minor, and I doubt anyone really notice it, but it would help improve this performance, because some of the dips you're seeing in resolution come from the fact that the MRT, this is the third rendering, it's using lots of dynamic light sources, it's struggling to do a lot of the work, therefore it dips the buffer size to keep that performance as close as possible, because bandwidth is a limitation. You then push through less bits into your system, therefore it's less bandwidth, you can do it in quicker time, and therefore you try and hit your target much better. It's all very complicated, I know, but I'm trying to explain it quickly here, you know, on a Sunday morning whilst having a cup of coffee. But essentially, what they've done here is quick wins. They're literally quick wins. They're things you can get it out, and that's why the dynamic scaling overall is lower on the premium consoles and the base consoles for this kind of target. And I suspect that resolution would improve with the performance alongside those sacrifices or optimization in terms of how the game runs. And some of these areas you can see, there's an obvious point where it uses point lights on the lightsaber when you're walking through an area. It spawns a point light above your head. You can see it here on the Xbox One S. This has an impact of around 20% on performance on the base console. You can see as I lift it up above Carl's head, the light spawns in, and then those shadow maps then cast in from the light, so you see shadows across everything now at that point, even alpha effects such as the leaves and the objects and the geometry. So a quick win there would be just turn off the shadow mapping of that light source. By all means spawn the light, but don't spawn the shadow maps that go along with it, and you probably wouldn't lose any of that performance. Now in addition, you've got the streaming part here, because I'm right on the edge of a sector loading point there, and that's why you get that stutter at the start, and then it comes back to more consistent, and all versions of the title show this. And also you can see the fact that it drops to that double buffered 20 FPS drop, which the game is double buffered, and that's because it's got no memory, I've mentioned that multiple times, and it improves performance and more specifically input latency, which we'll cover right at the end when we're going into the premium consoles. And talking of the premium consoles, you're now going to see the same test on that, and you can see that that actually has an impact on the Ps4 Pro. It actually also affects the Ps4 Pro to a lesser degree, a couple of frames, so around 10-12%, but it does affect it. But it doesn't really affect the Xbox One X, because it's a far more powerful machine. It's got far more bandwidth and more RAM, and therefore that GPU doesn't need to cut back these areas, because it can still get the work done in the time it needs. And you don't really see an impact on the Xbox One X doing the exact same test. You do get that little stutter point when it streams in data at that sector point I'm talking about, because we're right on the cusp of it here, and once it's loaded in, it goes back to that standard performance level. So this is why the X has better performance and better visuals effects, shadows like I've already covered, and some of the lighting effects because of the increase in resolution. They're more accurate, more pixels. But there are other signs that there's still optimization work to do, and bugs that crop up more often I saw on the X than on the PlayStation 4, the Pro, and that is that some of the effects actually are missing. And I covered this in my original premium analysis, although I did have them swapped round. So there's points where things just glitch and disappear. On the Xbox One X specifically, more often than the PS4 Pro, though you can get issues on both, which I'll cover momentarily. But you can see here the particle rain effects, which also sample light sources from around. They're on. And then later on in the same section here, they disappear. They don't come back on again, because they turn off when you go into a tunnel, and then they turn back on again when you come back out. And that just glitches out. And that was what I showed in my last video. It's a glitch. It's not a technical sacrifice. It's a glitch. It happens. They're on at this point here, and then they're off again later on. And again, like I say, I mislabeled it in that video, so please forgive me.
Apology accepted, Captain Nida.
Yeah, but overall there are some glitches in the game itself. The Xbox One suffers. You can see here the lens flare is missing, and even the alpha transparency is weaker on the Xbox One X here than it is on the PS4. And again, in the cutscene when you zoom in, it's completely missing on the Xbox One and present on the PS4. These minor glitches all point to the fact that the optimization stage hasn't really gotten all the way through its process just yet. You've already seen these issues, but there's other issues in the game. There's points where I can jump in the air on the PS4 and just fly around here and then drop back down again. There's points where enemies just fall through the floor. And to back this up, you can see that they're working to improve this. So the versions you've already seen on the base consoles, they were using version 103. Here you can see comparing the disc version on the right and the new version 103 on the left on PS4 Pro as an example. It's ever so slightly better, not a lot, but the lowest point is now 27 rather than 24, and it's minimising the amount of dips into that 66 millisecond point. The premium consoles are better than the base consoles, and I'll cover that now, but overall you can see they're working towards improvement, but there is much more to come, I'm sure, and it's not solved the issues at this point. And also there's that obviously margin of error. You run in and out of a section over and over again. Sometimes it's not as bad as last time, and this comes out, so it's well within margin of error, but there are some improvements already going on. But right now, as you've already seen on the base consoles, it's not fixed, and it's not fixed on the premium consoles, but there are options and there is a way to make it slightly better.
Turned on. Got one of us. Lay down suppressing fire. I'm up. Dodging a little fast. I got this. Yeah. Step up now.
So you can see there that again those shadow maps are of much higher quality, much more stable and cleaner on the Xbox One X and the Pro, and the resolution is better. So the Xbox One comes in at 2560 by 1440 in this mode, right down to around 1600 by 900 is its lowest point, and it really does the same thing in performance mode. Whereas the PS4 Pro has a high of 2240 by 1260, and then it can drop right down to around 1600 by 900 in this mode. And then if you push it to the 60 FPS mode, then you both get capped at 1080p, but they both drop below that. Again, the Xbox One X can drop to 900p, and the PS4 Pro pretty much goes into PS4 mode, and that means its lowest point is 1344 by 756. But again, that's not the most common resolution you see in the title, and some of that comes down to the fact that it's, again, those MRTs and those buffers being sampled and redrawn, therefore the resolution drops suddenly and then goes back up again. And that temporal reconstruction element pushes it back up to 1440p, and the Xbox One X looks like it's temporarily reconstructing it back to 4K, but again, you have to stand very still for that to make a difference. But the image improvement from both modes is obvious and significant, and it's also significant between themselves and the base console, so it is a much sharper, cleaner looking game on the Pro and the X, and obviously the X wins that by a mile because it's pushing a hell of a lot more pixels at all times, and that makes obvious sense. It is the most significantly powerful console there is. But it also shows that for the first time, I think, in a long time, a huge, significant increase that the premium consoles deliver over the base consoles. You've just seen the fight on Kashyyyk, and that really struggles. But you play that same section at 30 FPS on the premium consoles at high resolution, and it feels significantly more comfortable to play and more enjoyable. Now, the Xbox One X suffers less from these bandwidth streaming in issues than the Pro and the base consoles. Again, it's got more RAM, that really helps, and that's probably the biggest assistance because there's just more in there already. And then on top of that, it's got much better bandwidth. So those two factors combined, as I talked about way back when the console launched, or before it launched, this is the big factor, and this points again to why memory is so important. It also points to the fact that why it's limited on resolution, because like I've already covered, you can play around resolutions as quick wins to try and keep performance high, and that's why the dynamic scaling is in there, and that's why it works so well. So then when you move to the 60 FPS mode, it doesn't really perform anywhere close to 60 FPS. Nothing's really changed. You get to Kashyyyk section here, and it's largely 30 FPS on both machines. But it does help the solidity of the performance and the input times, and that is a key factor in all of this. So again, it's quite a high-performing title in terms of input times. So as always, using my own internal method of capturing input latency from a wired-up controller to a light, very similar to what I've covered on all my other titles. The Xbox One S, I'm going to do all the games here, they have a variety of input times: camera movement, action, attack, roll. They're all going to have various levels of input latency. So taking that into account, my television, which has around 20 milliseconds of time, the Xbox One S has an average of 155 milliseconds of input latency. That's between camera movement and action, and that's at the obviously 30 FPS mode. Then you move over to the premium consoles and you run that on the X or the Pro at 30 FPS. Then you get around 5 to 6 milliseconds improvement. So within margin of error, but it is slightly faster because it's more consistent, so around 149 milliseconds. But then when you move into that 60 FPS mode, which you can see on screen now, that significantly drops. That average drops right down to 107.4 milliseconds. So that's circa 44-45 milliseconds of improved latency, moving from 30 to 60 FPS. Now all modes use a double buffered Vsync, which means there's only 2 frames, the one you see and the one that's being rendered currently. And then if it dips down there, and you see this on the Pro and it stutters on the base consoles, which I covered earlier with the light test, it drops to that consistent levels of the next refresh cycle. So it will go from 60 to 30 to 20 and so on. And that's exactly why my frame time graph is designed like it is. I have the frame time and the frame rate on the same line because they are the same line. If you consistently sit at one line, you're going to get the same frame time and frame rate. So there's no point in having 2 separate frame times and frame rates because they're one in the same. Frame rate isn't as important as frame time, and that's why a game that's running at 60 FPS but keeps skipping between 33 milliseconds will feel better than a game that constantly jumps to 50 milliseconds. The bigger the latency and the gap between input and the next refresh cycle, the worse it will feel and look. With a game like this that requires high input times and accuracy, those higher refresh rates actually help how the game plays. It's not always the best looking because that inconsistency of going up to high refresh rates then back down again, but it can be the better one to play overall because it improves the input latency times like you can see. And again, that makes the game feel better. Even if it doesn't really run that much faster, it does make a difference because it's allowed to skip into 16 milliseconds far more often. And generally, the Pro version and the Xbox One X version are very evenly matched, so they've certainly done a cracking job in making sure they've balanced the game out overall. And the visual quality of the title, like I say, I've gone and spent all this time talking about it in depth, so this was probably my most in-depth analysis of a game's performance, simply because I think that it's always good to talk about these things and understand that there's never one thing in a game that's causing all of the issues, it's a combination thereof. And this is a title that literally proves time and time again that time and team are the most important part, not everything else. If you don't give the team the time to deliver the goods and optimize the code for the hardware it's running on, you get bad results. Now this isn't a terrible game by any means, I've played much worse performing games. Any From Software title probably performs very close to this in that 60 FPS unlocked mode by and large, but there's no frame pacing issues here, which is a big benefit to the title in terms of the kind of game that it is. But that Unreal Engine 4 does have to take some of the impact. We've seen this time and time again. I've covered this time and time again. If we go back to Batman Arkham Knight, which I covered on Unreal Engine 3 quite a while ago, it took the premium consoles to fix those consistent streaming and texture bandwidth issues that plagued both the consoles and PC. It's always suffered with that, texture quality, and we saw this on the PC version with the texture RAM, and as you span the camera around, all those issues, again, going back to the PCI issue I mentioned earlier. And Unreal Engine 4 has that same high overhead, and that's why we see a lot of titles on consoles that run sub 1080p or sub 900p on the Xbox One, because it actually does have quite a high overhead, and therefore all of that needs to be factored in. When you're writing code, it's also to the engine and the API. There's multiple ways to handle buffer targets on DirectX 12, DirectX 11. DirectX 12 doesn't even support tiled resources or reserved resourcing. There's lots of changes in terms of how you develop a game to the hardware, and even if the hardware is very close together like the Xbox One, the PS4, that doesn't really mean that much, because if the API is significantly different and you've not got access to those, or the engine you're running it on has a certain level of methods in terms of how it's handling streaming assets, bringing your code into the engine and converting that to a binary exe, all of those areas will have an impact. So you might write for the same hardware but get significantly different results based on how the API and the software levels work. So this again is probably a very long-winded video that many people won't really enjoy, but I've put it together because I wanted to get back to doing more technical stuff, which I always used to do, and I never know whether people like it or not. So again, if you like this kind of stuff, if you want me to go more in depth, want to talk about things more in depth, show examples, go through code, all those kind of things, then leave comments down below, because I do enjoy doing this, and it's easy because I can just sit and talk to you about these things and use examples on screen. This analysis is obviously a very in-depth one, but not what you would expect by talking about the visuals and the quality. Overall, it's a beautiful looking game. Like I say, the PBR-based materials in the game, it's not going for photorealistic, it's going for hyper-realistic. There are certainly weaker elements, certainly characters in the game that look a bit weak. Chewbacca, like I mentioned, the Wookiees look terrible in the title. The hair quality and the rendering, the lighting, I think, is probably one of its biggest benefits. It does does that superbly. So it's a title that I've really enjoyed playing, and I'm right at the end, so I'm just hoping to finish it off today actually and have a bit of a break now to put this video together. But hopefully this was something you guys and girls enjoyed. If you did, please like, subscribe and all that kind of good stuff. If not, leave your comments below. What did you think? What do you think of the game? What do you think of this game overall? What do you think of the next generation of consoles? Where does your priorities lie? What do you want me to talk about in terms of future videos? All those things and more are coming up in Michael Goes Mad on a Sunday morning. Yes, apologies for this one. It was a bit rambly, but again, time is of the essence for me all the time. And I get to put these videos together in literally 2 or 3 hours. It's really quite tough. So hopefully you enjoyed it. I'll catch you very soon on the next one.
Visitation is not permitted. You cannot escape.